Sometimes reality is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to dive into one of those stories.
Oh, this is going to be good.
It is. It really is. We're talking about the Sampoong department store collapse in Seoul, South Korea, back in 1995.
A tragedy, that's for sure.
Yeah, you actually sent in a YouTube video about it, so we'll be looking at everything that led up to it. And then, well, the collapse itself, and then what happened afterwards.
The aftermath of something like this, well, it's not just about rebuilding. It's about reckoning with the human choices that got you there in the first place.
It really is. So, okay, picture this. June 29th. Sweltering day in Seoul.
Sounds familiar, right?
Right. And the AC is broken in the Sampoong department store.
Geez, that's the last thing you need on a hot day like that.
No kidding. But this seemingly small detail, it's actually a hint of the disaster that's about to happen.
It's crazy how these little things can be, well, omens almost.
Exactly. And two employees, Pongo and Gia, they were right in the middle of it all. Pongo is on the 5th floor.
That 5th floor. It's going to play a big part in this story, They added it later against the advice of the original engineers.
Yeah, not a great idea in hindsight. So Pongo's up there, and at first he's just annoyed because his head chef keeps yelling at everyone to get out.
Wait, so he didn't know what was happening?
No, not at first. He had no idea why everyone was panicking. But then, suddenly, lights started shattering, and, well, he realized it was time to run.
I can't even imagine that moment. Suddenly your whole world is just falling apart.
Yeah. And meanwhile, Gia was in the basement. She sold crystals there.
Crystals? In the basement? That's kind of...
I know, right? But anyway, she'd taken a break from the heat, and as she was heading back, her manager starts screaming at her to run.
So she barely made it out.
Barely. She remembers this explosion of crystals and debris, like it was flying right at her.
Oh, my God.
Both Pongo and Gia, they had 20 seconds to get out. That's it.
20 seconds. That's
Yep.
what, like the time it takes to sing Happy Birthday?
Exactly. It's terrifying how fast everything happened.
Yeah. And I'm guessing not everyone was so lucky.
No, not everyone. 21-year-old Michael, he was working in a shoe store when the building just collapsed around him. He was trapped. Total darkness, barely any air.
So he was just stuck there.
Yeah, with no food, no water, nothing.
11 days. Can you imagine 11 days trapped under all that rubble? The claustrophobia, the darkness, not knowing if anyone's going to find you.
It's almost impossible to imagine, right? He found a little bit of water, dripping, probably full of concrete dust, but he even ate wet cardboard to survive.
What cardboard?
It's hard to fathom what he went through. And at first he wasn't alone. There were 2 other people trapped with him.
Oh, wow. At least he had someone.
Yeah, for a while they talked to each other. It gave him some hope, But then they died.
Oh, God. So he's alone again.
In the dark.
Yeah, just waiting.
That's got to do something to a person, to go through that, to see others die while you're trapped and not knowing if you're next.
Yeah. I mean, his survival is incredible, but the psychological toll...
Absolutely. And while all this is happening underground, above ground, it's just chaos.
People must have been terrified.
I mean, this was a symbol of their city, of progress, and it just crumbles in seconds.
Did they know what had happened?
No, at first there was so much confusion. I mean, it was a tense time back then, so a lot of people thought it was a North Korean attack.
Wow. Makes sense, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, when something like that happens, people try to find an explanation, anything to make sense of it.
Right. But eventually the dust settled, and it was clear. This wasn't some attack. This was a man-made disaster.
Oh, a series of bad choices, really.
Choices with real consequences. And this is where I think the story gets even more tragic, because we start to see how profit was put ahead of people's safety.
Yeah, the investigation after the collapse, it revealed so much negligence. It was, it was almost criminal.
And at the center of it all, there's this guy, Lee Jin, the businessman who owned the store.
Right, and he was ambitious, to say the least.
Ambitious and, from what I've read, not very concerned about safety.
He wanted more floor space, so he cut down on the number of those support columns.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that hold the whole building up.
He actually reduced the number of support columns.
And to make it worse, he even had the steel rods removed from them, all to save money.
That's insane.
It was like a disaster waiting to happen.
But I bet that wasn't all, was it?
No, not even close. He also chose this cheaper construction method called flat slab. It's okay for some buildings, but not for something this big, especially with that extra 5th floor.
So he was cutting corners everywhere.
Everywhere. And you know what's crazy? even with all that, there were warning signs, like tons of them. Cracks were appearing in the ceiling, doors weren't closing right. One employee even saw a container of vegetables slide across a refrigerator because the floor was tilted.
Whoa, wait, seriously, like the whole floor was slanted.
Yeah. It's amazing how they just ignored it all.
It's like, how do you not notice that? A slanted floor, that's not normal.
I know, right? And it gets worse. One of the managers actually showed Lee Jun's son the floor, like how much it was tilting. And the son just, he shrugged it off, said it was shitty construction.
Shitty construction. That's all he had to say.
Yeah, that's the attitude they had. But that's not all. The air conditioning units on the roof, those huge things, they were vibrating like crazy, and it was actually weakening the structure even more.
Oh, so even the AC was part of the problem.
Exactly. People complained about the noise, so Lee Jun had them moved. But not, like, properly. They just dragged them across the roof.
Dragged them.
Yeah. Causing even more damage. It's like every decision they made was pushing the building closer and closer to collapse.
It's almost like they were trying to make it collapse.
And on top of all that, the engineers who were trying to warn Lee Jun about the danger, well, he just ignored them.
Ignored the engineers. Seriously.
Yeah, he fired the original construction company because they wouldn't go along with his plans for that 5th floor. And then he hired a new team, people who were less experienced and probably more willing to, cut corners.
Because they were probably desperate for the job.
Probably. It's a classic example of how power and money can make people blind to the truth. They didn't want to hear it.
It's tragic. And on the day of the collapse, it sounds like Lee Jun had one last chance to do the right thing.
You're talking about the evacuation.
Yeah.
Right. So the cracks were getting bigger. There was even a column that had punched through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
And the executives, they were telling Lee Jun they needed to evacuate.
And he didn't listen.
No. Instead of thinking about the hundreds of people in the building, he ordered them to start removing merchandise, like the expensive stuff.
So he was more worried about his stuff than people's lives.
It's unbelievable. While people were shopping, eating, just going about their day, the building was literally falling apart above them. And then it just collapsed.
502 people. It's hard to even wrap your head around a number like that.
It's just devastating. And the aftermath, it was just as bad. The rescuers, the families, they were all going through so much.
Searching for loved ones, hoping they were still alive. It must have been agonizing.
It was. Some families, they even went to the dump sites, digging through the rubble there, desperate to find any sign of their loved ones.
Oh, my God.
And then there's Lee Jun. His response to the whole thing, it was unbelievable. He tried to blame others, acted like it wasn't a big deal. He even said, "Do you think I wanted this to happen? I have nothing to say."
What? That's just cold.
People were furious. They wanted justice. And eventually, he and his son went to prison.
Not long enough, though, I bet.
No. 7.5 years for him, 7 for his son. It wasn't enough for a lot of people. But there's another side to this story, too. The fact that a lot of the victims were connected to powerful people.
Ah, so their voices were heard more.
It makes you wonder, right? Would things have been different if it had been, different people?
It's a question worth asking. And this whole thing, it also exposed some major flaws in South Korea's, like emergency response system, there were communication problems, lack of coordination, the whole system for helping the victims and their families, it wasn't good enough.
No, it wasn't. And then there was the issue of the memorial. The families wanted a place to remember their loved ones, but the government, at first, they resisted.
Why would they resist something like that?
They said it was about real estate.
Seriously. They were worried about real estate. After all that happened.
It's hard to believe, right? But eventually, they did build a memorial.
Did they at least build it at the site of the collapse?
No, they put it in a remote location, far away from the city. A lot of people saw that as a way to just forget about what happened.
To move on without really acknowledging the tragedy.
Exactly.
But amidst all this sadness and anger, there were also these incredible stories of human resilience. Like Mr. Jung. He was a lawyer, and he lost all 3 of his daughters in the collapse.
His eldest daughter, she was amazing. She'd overcome blindness and become a professor. It was a huge loss, not just for him, but for the whole community.
And how did he cope with that?
He channeled his grief into helping others. He donated all the money he received to the organizations that his daughter had supported.
That's powerful. Turning such a horrible loss into something positive.
It really is. And then there's Gia, the woman who sold crystals in the basement. She was trapped for 13 days.
13 days.
Yeah. And when they finally rescued her, she said, I want to go on a date with the Appa who rescued me.
She said that while she was on a stretcher.
Yeah. It was this moment of, like, lightheartedness in the middle of all this darkness.
People needed that, I think, a little bit of hope.
They did. And her story, along with Michael's, they became symbols of hope for the whole country. Proof that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, the human spirit can endure.
It's inspiring. But at the same time, we can't forget about all the people who didn't make it. The hundreds who died. Their stories are important too.
It's true. We can't let their stories be forgotten.
The Sampoong collapse, it really was a turning point for South Korea, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It forced everyone to look at the corruption, the cutting corners, the whole system that allowed this to happen. It was a wake-up call.
They had to face some hard truths about how fast their country was growing and, well, how justice wasn't always fair.
Yeah, and it also put a huge spotlight on building safety.
Right, like how do we make sure this never happens again? What did they learn from this awful tragedy?
Well, for one thing, they made big changes to the building codes and safety regulations. I mean, even today, the Sampoong collapse is shaping how they build things in South Korea.
So some good came out of it, at least in that sense.
Yeah, but it also makes you think about, like, who's really responsible? How do you make sure people are held accountable?
And how do you make sure the government is actually protecting its people?
Exactly. It wasn't just the building that failed, it was the whole system. The inspections, the people in charge, they all failed.
And, even with all the rules in the world, if no one's enforcing them, if people aren't speaking up when they see something wrong, well, what good are they?
That's so true. Like, remember all those warning signs they ignored? If someone had just said something, really pushed the issue, maybe things would have been different.
It takes courage to speak up, though, especially when you're going against people with power and money.
You're right. We need a culture where safety comes first, where people feel like they can speak up without being punished for it.
And it's more than just rules and regulations. It's about changing how we think. We have to stop valuing profit over everything else. Stop thinking it's okay to cut corners.
Like human lives are more important than saving a few bucks.
Yeah, exactly. Safety shouldn't be something you compromise on. And this whole story, it really shows what can happen when we forget that.
It's like Gia said, the woman who survived for 13 days in the rubble. She said, tragedy doesn't really pick people to happen to. It can happen to anyone.
Wow, powerful words.
It's a reminder that we're all connected. What we do, the choices we make, they affect everyone.
So what do we do with all this? How do we make sure something like this never happens again? How do we build a world where safety, accountability, where human life is actually valued?
Big questions. Tough questions, but important ones. And, this whole deep dive, it's been a roller coaster. Sadness, anger, but also hope. We saw how easily things can go wrong, but we also saw incredible acts of resilience.
We heard from the people who were there, learned about the mistakes that were made, and really had to think about our own values,
It's a story that makes you think, that's for sure. And hopefully it'll make us all a little more aware, a little more proactive, a little more willing to speak up when we see something wrong.
Because in the end, that's how we prevent these kinds of tragedies, by learning from the past and working together to create a better future.
Yeah, exactly. And on that note, we want to thank you for joining us for this deep dive. It's been heavy, but we hope you've learned something from it, and we hope it'll spark some conversations, some ideas about how we can all do our part to make the world a safer place.